Japan was never capable of defeating the United States. So why did they still attack Pearl Harbor? On the surface, it seems like they're deliberately seeking their own demise, but in reality, it was a desperate gamble, betting the fate of the nation. November 26, 1940 India. Japanese attack fleet, consisting of 6 aircraft, carriers, 2 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft ready to depart, moving towards the assembly point out to get to Oahu Island in Hawaii, about 230 miles to the north. They have only one goal: surprise attack. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is currently anchored at Pearl Harbor port. This raid was scheduled for December 7, aiming to inflict heavy losses on the U.S. Navy, paving the way for Japan to gain dominance in Asia. Although they ultimately achieved a tactical victory, but at the same time, it accelerated the course of World War II and became the trigger that led to the collapse of the Japanese Empire. So, what seemed like a suicidal act, this is ultimately just the foolish arrogance of Japan. Or is it a risky move? When there's no way back, why did Japan choose to attack Pearl Harbor? And what mistakes did they make? This ultimately led to their defeat in the war. Second World War answered this question first. We need to go back. In the 1930s of the 20th century, this time Japan is in a state of rapid development. After Meiji Restoration, Japan achieved success by absorbing technology, the West, and the expansion of its militarists quickly rose to become a major power in Asia. They also harbor ambitions to surpass England and catch up with America, even achieve global dominance. However, despite having great ambitions, Japan still faces an extremely serious problem. Small territory, natural resources are extremely scarce. They don't have enough coal, iron, and steel, especially oil, a crucial strategic resource. In that context, after years of preparation, year 1931, Japan launches the September 18th event, the first step in the conspiracy to build an empire. They brazenly invaded northeastern China, frantically plundering coal, oil, and countless other resources. Chinese workers are forced to work day and night. Over 200,000 civilians were tortured to death. The bodies were thrown directly into mass graves. In the following years, Japan continues to invade Chinese territory in order to seize it, extract even more resource, until July 7, 1937, Luang Kaoqiu incident exploded. The two countries officially entered into a full-scale war. Initially, the Japanese army relied on its military superiority, have achieved consecutive victories while encircling vast territories. Japan carried out the Nanjing Massacre, along with the bombing raids, terrorism targeting Chinese civilians, and many other atrocities. This provoked widespread condemnation from the international community. As the battle lines continued to expand up to the year 1939, war has reached a stalemate. Tenacious resistance of the Chinese army has been depleted. Serious human and material resources of Japan tank war. The prolonged economic downturn has led to a continuous decline in the Japanese economy. The government is under immense pressure to get out of the difficult situation. Japan is forced to turn its attention to other regions, search for new resource and logistics sources at this very moment. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the United States is trying to maintain its neutral policy, establishes no alliance with any party. They also did not provide military aid, even ban enacting a series of neutral laws to avoid drawing the U.S. into the war. However, in reality, war broke out in Europe, along with Japan's crimes in China. This makes it difficult for the U.S. to remain on the sidelines. As domestic public opinion gradually shifted in favor of intervention, the isolationist stance began to waver. Year 1930 Ninnius. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs New Neutrality Act. Easing the arms embargo. Allowing the U.S. to sell weapons to Britain and France, provided these countries pay for and arrange their own transportation. Then came the year 1940-1. The U.S. enacted a lease law, though more comprehensive land list. Lending includes not just selling, transfer, or exchange of materials, and also provided large quantities of food free of charge, military supplies and weapons for the Allied forces, China, and the Soviet Union. This also allowed us to receive invaluable strategic support. Up until now, the U.S. has nominally maintained neutrality, but their position was already very clear. That made Japan country as asterisk resources are in great need. The war faces major challenges, and they have repeatedly warned the U.S. that they will threaten to take strong measures. How ironic? In fact, 80% of Japan's oil is produced. It's dependent on the U.S. again. Even scrap metal, coal, and many other resources. Another important strategy was also imported from the U.S. The conflict between resource dependence and external pressure forced dependent. They had to choose between the predetermined northern strategy and between the northern strategy and the southern strategy. Japan is forced to make a choice. Although the northern strategy received support from certain groups, Japanese military But when the war of aggression against China fell into a stalemate. Long-term success plus failure, the heavy burden of the Japanese army against the Soviet mechanized forces in the battle. I am not here. The ambition to advance north has suffered a major blow. In that context, Japan shifts course and heads south, using the Navy as the main offensive. Force. Conspiracy to dominate Southeast Asia, especially resource-rich areas traded such as oil and rubber in the east, in this part of the Netherlands, and the Malay Peninsula in the year 1940, when the German nation will break through the French defenses. Team Paris lost and moved to Japan. Quickly seized this strategic opportunity. Sent troops to occupy northern Indochina, which was under French control, to plunder the resources here to relieve pressure. Shortage of war materials, however. This action made him the country that controls Myanmar and the Malay Peninsula. They clearly felt the threat from Japan's expansionism. At the same time, the United States also considered this an act of aggression. New comb from Japan directly threatened U.S. interests in the Pacific. Therefore, the U.S. took the lead in imposing an embargo on Japan, banning the export of steel, copra, and other strategic materials. These critical industrial resources, more than 80%, depended on imports from the U.S. So the embargo was like a noose tightening around Japan's neck, driving the country into a state of desperation. And yet, not only did Japan fail to learn its lesson, but by July of that year, they brazenly occupied southern French area into a springboard for their plan to advance into Southeast Asia. This action truly provoked the United States, leading the U.S. to freeze all Japanese assets in America and cut off the supply of oil shortly after. Britain and the Netherlands. U.S. allies also quickly joined in forming an economic blockade consisting of the U.S., Britain, China, and the Netherlands. The Japanese military called this action the ABCD encirclement. The cutoff of imports and exports dealt a heavy blow to Japan, causing the country to lose up to 94% of its oil supply. Japan fell into a severe crisis under the absolute oil embargo. Japanese Navy and Air Force, and even the country's entire industry would fall into a state of paralysis according to estimates. Without decisive action, Japan's oil reserves could only be maintained for about 18 months, backed into a corner. On one hand, tried through diplomatic negotiations to force the U.S. to lift the embargo on oil and strategic supplies, but progress was not favorable. At all, the United States set a condition to restore trade. Japan must immediately withdraw its troops from China and Indochina. For Japan, accepting this demand was no different from admitting total defeat, and even shaking its ambition to build a colonial empire, something that Japan could not accept. On the other hand, Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, establishing the Axis military alliance, with these two countries sending a tough message to the U.S. Any U.S. military intervention could trigger a war, and conflict could even break out on both the east and west coasts of the U.S. In response, President Roosevelt immediately reacted, strongly ordering the deployment of the Pacific Fleet's main force to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to warn Japan, and at the same time demonstrate the possibility of U.S. intervention by force. In this grave situation, Japan had only one path left: to use force to seize Southeast Asia, ordered to secure strategic resources like oil and rubber to maintain its war machine. However, the southern advance camp, a direct confrontation with British and American military forces in the Far East. What was even more disadvantageous was the U.S. military posture in the Pacific, especially the airbase in the Philippines and the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, which became a direct threat to Japan's southern advance strategy once Japan attacked British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. Pacific Fleet would very likely depart from Pearl Harbor to sever Japan's lines of attack, even posing a direct threat to Japanese territory. Therefore, after much analysis and discussion, the Japanese military came to the conclusion that the conflict with the U.S. has become irrelevant. Instead of sitting and waiting to die, they decided to strike first to gain the upper hand. But the question is, is there a chance of winning against the United States? Or not, in the face of a serious In Japan, heated debates have erupted over countermeasures. Heated debates quickly erupted. Minister of the Army, Dung Duyan Hakkog Heiki, strongly advocates the strategy of striking first. First, we must attack Pearl Harbor, weakening the power of the American fleet. From there, I'll dedicate time to Japan. Plundering resources in the Pacific and Southeast Asia to strengthen the argument. Dong Duyan Anhako also believes that pressure from the U.S. has left Japan with no way out, inciting the military to believe that only war can break the crisis. Resource crisis, therefore, for Japan is nothing short of a life-or-death gamble. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro at the time clearly saw the trend. Understanding that Japan is not strong enough, wage a protracted war with the United States. He tried to reduce tensions between Japan and the U.S. through diplomatic negotiation shopping to exchange it for American work providing resources with a limited number of concessions. However, this plan failed due to opposition from the faction. Tough in the military, despite worldview, civilian officials are aware of the risks of war with the United States, but in the context of ever-expanding military power, they didn't have enough influence to change the situation. Things to avoid. You was the planner of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto, Isaro initially, they also strongly opposed going to war with the U.S. He studied abroad at university, he attended Harvard, and previously served as a military attaché in the United States. Therefore, one should understand the enormous difference very clearly. Regarding industrial strength between the two countries, in a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, once warned that if Japan became an enemy of the United States, then, if there is initial victory, they will eventually be defeated by the industrial power of the United States. Crushed. Even the emperor on the surface, Hirohito, appears to be taking no sides. The military was asked to conduct careful research, but in reality, he implicitly approved the war faction's plan. Continue entering the year 1941. Japan's fate has fallen into a deep crisis. Resources are blocked, diplomatic failures and domestic tension. Standing at a crossroads of history, Japan was forced to make a choice within a very short period of time. Should we make concessions to the U.S. or break the stalemate through war? 16th. Under heavy pressure, Prime Minister Kinofumi Maro was forced to resign. The next Dodong Yingji has been appointed Prime Minister of Japan. The cabinet was officially formed, originating from the army. He advocated expanding the war outwards and firmly opposed the withdrawal of troops from China. Regarding negotiations with the U.S., Japan appears extremely pessimistic. To quickly eliminate the U.S. military threat at sea, regarding the plan to advance southward, the Pacific Fleet is stationed at the foot of the Pearl. The port became a thorn in the side that had to be removed. First, once this base is destroyed in a short period of time, the U.S. will no longer have forces significant in the Pacific force to acknowledge Japan's new order in East Asia. Return to the negotiating table and end the war. This would help avoid falling into a prolonged war of attrition. Simply put, it was a swift victory to gain the initiative. On the one hand, Japan used negotiations. Peace is like a smoke bomb to distract the U.S. To lower their guard. On the other hand, secrets are handed over to gamblers in war. Yamamoto Isoroku planned the Operation Zai. Japan assembles 6 naval task forces. The airport has over 400 aircraft/ship taken advantage of the harsh weather conditions in the North Pacific. March finally approaching Pearl Harbor. Approximately 230 nautical miles to the north. December 7th. 1941th official plan has been implemented. 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time. The first wave of attacks consisted of 183 aircraft. It unexpectedly appeared in the skies over Pearl Harbor. The American forces were completely caught off guard and had no time to react. The Japanese aircraft formations were divided into 3 groups. The first 2 groups consisted of bombers. Dive bombers and escort fighter targeting aircraft. Hangarsoned, the aircraft are parked at the air base on the island. The American planes were parked because of fears of sabotage, one by one. But this is what makes them become an ideal target for Japanese aircraft. The remaining group consisted of torpedo bombers, targeting warships in the harbor, especially the battleships that were neatly anchored. Americans believed that the waters here are too shallow to use torpedoes, but the Japanese invented a type brand new torpedo designed specifically for Pearl Harbor waters. Create a devastating attack. Just 5 minutes after the attack began, for American battleships were hit one after another. USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and quickly capsized. The USS Arizona's ammunition depot exploded due to bombs. After about 10 minutes, the tremendous explosion generated high temperatures and shockwaves swallowed the entire ship, resulting in the deaths of 1,175 sailors. It became the most catastrophic scene in the Pearl event. Port 854A.M. The second wave of attacks consisted of 170 aircraft. The onslaught continues. The planes were also divided into 3 groups and continued to strike warships in the harbor. Pearl Harbor, airbase and infrastructure. However, after the first attack, the U.S. military has entered a state of high alert. Anti-aircraft firepower was rapidly reinforced. This reduced the effectiveness of the Japanese second attack. A significant reduction, 110 short minutes. The Japanese troops struck, or damaged 18 American warships, including all 8 devices Pacific fleets, armored class, and simultaneously destroyed 188 aircraft. causing 2,403 American soldiers died and 1,178 people were injured. The base's infrastructure was also severely damaged. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was almost completely paralyzed, while the Japanese lost only 29 aircraft, a small submarine and 64 soldiers. The objectives of the operation were fully achieved. But the nature of the dramatic part is, the ships. The U.S. airport was offshore at the time of the attack. Participate in the drill. They were not in the port, so they escaped disaster, retained fighting force to the subsequent counterattack from a tactical perspective. Plan Yamato's products have achieved tremendous success, paralyzing the main force of the Pacific Fleet. This temporarily prevented the U.S. from intervening in the expansion campaign, but southern Gunna Japan while also hoping to achieve military victory, forcing the U.S. to negotiate concessions. However, due to this strategic thinking, the Japanese army was too focused on attacking the tanks, borderline while neglecting important targets such as fuel depots, repair workshops, and logistics facilities. Meanwhile, these very facilities are the foundation. This helps the U.S. military maintain its long-term war capabilities. In addition, the waters at Pearl Harbor are quite shallow. Therefore, most of the sunken shipwrecks lie on the shallow seabed. This facilitated later salvage and repair by the American military. Quickly restore fleet strength for Japan. The direct result of the attack on Pearl Harbor ports only offer a short-term strategic advantage. On the very day the attack occurred, Japan launches simultaneous offensive alt-front campaigning. The Pacific and Southeast Asian Thailand surrendered. Just a few hours Thailand then quickly formed an alliance with Japan. Guam, the Web, the Philippine archipelago is also known ACES control along with his colonies such as Malaya and Hong Kong. They also fell one after another in a short period of time. Not only Thathis, two main warships, Prince of Wales and Repens also got bombed by planes. Japanese torpedoes sunk off the coast of Malaya, a heavy blow to the Federation's naval power. Until the beginning of the year 1942, the Japanese offensive was as powerful as a raging torrent, continuously launching campaigns, a large-scale operation targeting the Dutch East Indies. Burma belongs to Singapore, New Guinea, and Solomon Islands sexually, as they wanted. U.S. Pacific Fleet. We couldn't react in time. Ben. And Japan quickly achieved its goal. His strategy, thanks to the success of the military raid, Japan established a vast colonial empire. Control source important resources in Southeast Asia, such as oil mines and rubber. The goal of using war to sustain oneself has been temporarily achieved. War, however, for America's effectiveness of the attack on Pearl Harbor, this is completely contrary to what Japan desires. It not only failed to force America to submit, but it was also like a heavy hammer blow that shattered the policy. The isolation that the U.S. has maintained persisted for many years. The very next day, after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous speech before Congress. Day of Shame. We strongly condemn Japan's cowardly and unprovoked attack, and simultaneously demand a declaration of war against Japan. The U.S. Congress voted almost unanimously through a resolution declaring war, and the United States officially entered World War II. Military. The U.S. quickly activated the general mobilization mechanism for war, mobilizing electricity, resource raw materials, and enormous industrial production capacity. Toto served the total war effort. Patriotic spirit. Hundreds of thousands of young volunteers enlisted in the Army, helping the Army expand rapidly until the war ends. In the year 1945, Army numbers, the U.S. population increased to approximately 12 million. Its scale is more than 5 times larger than before the war. At the same time, the U.S. was actively seeking to establish an alliance with the U.K., the Soviet Union, and other countries united to confront the Axis powers. June 1942. Battle of the Michigan. It became a turning point in the Pacific War, thanks to deciphering the Japanese Army's code. The U.S. military had prior knowledge of the enemy's battle plans, at the cost of losing an aircraft carrier, 1 destroyer. In 147 aircraft, the U.S. military sank 4 aircraft carriers. In a Japanese cruiser destroyed 332 aircraft. Simultaneously killed approximately 3,500 Japanese soldiers. This battle weakened the Japanese Navy's strength, was severely weakened, reversing the course of the Pacific battlefield. This caused the USS's to shift from a strategic defensive stance to an offensive one. Strategic Japan once hoped for an end to the war, quickly to force the U.S. to make concessions, but ultimately triggered the war. Total force of the United States awakened, the sleeping giant. This led to war in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. It enters the depletion phase, prolonging the attack on Pearl Harbor. Is essentially a decision. Gamblers of dictatorship and extreme nationalism. Japan is considered an example. Typical example of using victor tactics to conceal strategic failure. ILO. Initially, the raid was a tactical success, but generous industrial power and the United States' ability to wage war, the scales of victory quickly tipped in favor of the United States. When the military Japanese taekwondo gamble, the fate of the nation, on war. The strategic failure was almost inevitable. The war was fueled by those expansionist ambitions. It ultimately ended with mistakes. Japan's serious strategy.